Hi, today I'm going to talk about perception, how we learn to see, and how that applies to bonsai and the art of bonsai drawing. So today I want to talk about the idea of perception, that is how we learn to see. And so when it comes to drawing, we often draw what we think we're seeing, not how actually something appears. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break that down, and what I have as a goal is to help you learn how to be discerning in regards to how you see something, and then be able to translate that into bonsai drawing. So let's start this from the standpoint of a child. Say you ask a child to draw a tree and their family and a house and maybe, a mountain in the background or something like that. And so they'll start like this. They'll have their piece of paper. And if you go on Google or something like that, you're going to see a ton of these pictures. And then what they're going to do is they're going to do something like this, where they're going to make the ground, the bottom of the paper, the actual ground. So they think of the bottom of the paper actually as the bottom, and then they might do like something like this, and then come out and do their tree like that. And if you said do a tree, then your family, they're going to make this dominant. That's going to be their first choice, is to do that. So at this point, maybe they'll draw their house, and their house might be fairly small, because it's not what's important to what they want to do with a window and maybe even a chimney. So they'll draw something like that to represent their house, and then when they start doing their family, they might do their father really big, and then the mother smaller, and then maybe holding their hand, and maybe they have a little sister, and this little sister is like here, really little, and then a baby might be just like a little dot or something. And that's really how they would approach doing that drawing. You see it all the time. You go onto Google, you look for children's drawings, but they're never happy with this. They already recognize that in space everything is full. When they look, they know that everything is full and everything when they're looking. So what they'll do is they'll tend to put like a big giant smiley face sun with rays coming out to fill that space of the drawing, and then they might even put like a mountain in the background, something like that. And that is pretty typical for a child's drawing when you give them that task. So you can see that, again, this goes back to the imagined space. It goes back to what they perceive that scene is, and this is what they're going to end up doing. So if you ask an adult to do the same thing, they'll probably do some research. They'll look at some photos that they have. They might go onto Google, and they're going to do some more research in regards to their perception of space, because they have all this experience. And so what they'll do in a similar fashion is you give them the same piece of paper. What they might do in this case is they might start with, say, the tree is up here. So they're not going to use the bottom. They're not going to think of the bottom as the actual bottom of something. And then they might have some branches. They're going to come out a little more sophisticated in regards to drawing their branches, and then their foliage of the tree. And this is at different levels. A lot of people stop drawing around 6th grade, and it's because they start to become very self-critical, as well as they want people to reinforce them, and they don't necessarily get that reinforcement, and so they quit. Now, if you quit at 6th grade reading, you'd be at a 6th grade level reading. And so most people are at about a 4th to 6th grade level drawing when they've stopped drawing, and they don't continue that on to high school. So don't be worried about don't be worried about those type of things when you're learning to draw. But they'll draw something like this. They might even draw like a, I don't know, like a sidewalk coming past it, something like this. And then they'll draw their house, but their house will be somewhat obscured by the tree in the front, and they'll give it some perspective on their house. And they may show like their kids playing in the field, in front of the yard. They may show, like this is a lawn or a fence, and they may show, draw, a father, I don't know, mowing the lawn. So he's here mowing the lawn, and the mother doing something else or whatever. And then they'll show like maybe a series of more things, more hills in the back. Now what they'll do is they'll be pretty proportional. They'll show the children fairly large playing in the front and the father being smaller because it's further back, as well as they're going to overlap and show the tree actually overlaps the house. It's a much more sophisticated way of approaching drawing, but it's still this idea of how an adult perceives space versus how a child perceives space. And most people, when you become an advanced artist, you're doing this very, and you're trying to work in the real world, real drawing type of stuff, not real world, but real representation. It's going to be a very high level sophistication, but most people are just in between here. They're just right around in this area in their drawing. And that's why I keep saying this over and over again, that art is a learnable process. You can learn how to draw. It's just that where did you stop in this level as you progressed in age? Did you stop over here at 6th grade, or did you stop here at high school? It really depends on where you stopped in regards to the level of your sophistication when it comes to drawing. And that's also going to apply when we start talking about bonsai drawing. So one thing I want to focus on right now has to do with space and how we understand space, our perception of space. And so as you can see in this child's drawing, space is very flat. Everything is super flat. So they see the world in 3 dimensionals, but when it comes to the paper, they really flatten things out. So you're working in just 2 dimensions. But an adult drawing really starts to think of space as areas of depth. And in art, we generally have what's called a foreground here, we have a middle ground here, we have a background here. This is very typical in art, in landscape drawing or painting, is that you have these distinctions between foreground, middle ground, and background. And that gives us this idea of space. This is not unique to real drawing either. It's also something that comes up when you do abstract painting, because there is space in abstract painting. And but we're going to be in the descriptive world, so we're going to stick to this type of more real type of drawing. So how do we define space? Well, one way that we define space, our perception of space, is by overlapping things. So I can have, say, I'm just going to draw a circle here, and then I can have another circle behind that, and another circle behind that, and another circle behind that. And this gives me an idea of depth here. So we have this one circle, it's overlapping this circle, it's overlapping that circle, it's overlapping this circle. How does that apply to bonsai drawing? Well, if I'm drawing bonsai and all I have is, say, I just have this kind of outline of the foliage. Here's the pot. That's a very flat space. But if we start to overlap, in other words, I take this part of the foliage here and I distinguish that, and then this part of the foliage here, and I distinguish this part of the foliage to be in front of, say, this part of the foliage, and in front, and this one's further back, and that one's further back, and this one's further back. I start to get this idea of depth. Let me give you an example. Say I have a twin trunk bonsai. And if I just do the contour of that, so I have one trunk coming up here, and then I have another trunk coming over there. And if I just do the outline like this, it doesn't make sense to us. It's not, it gives us a misunderstanding of what's happening as far as depth. Which trunk is front of the other trunk? We don't know that by this kind of drawing. So an easy solution to that is just to overlap. Now I know that this part of the foliage is in front of that part of the foliage. And that really just is just simply the idea of overlapping. So what's the next idea of perception? Well, the idea of perception is that we clearly understand the space. We understand what's in front of the other, what that space is about, what are the objects we're looking at. And so the first was overlapping, but now we're going to just talk about ambiguous space. So say I draw a picture like this. It's going to be very simple. So I draw this square and I draw a circle in it. Now, that's not going to tell you anything about what that space is like. Like, for instance, is it a ball on top of a piece of paper? Or is it a hole inside the paper? We have no idea what's going on with that space. But I can easily do the same thing, and I can say I draw the circle this time, and then I draw an object like this, and then I draw the square. All of a sudden my space is activated. I've activated the space by putting this in, so I know that this is in front of that, which is in front of this. And I've already created this idea of space. I haven't done any shadowing or shading or anything on this, and it already informs that. Let's say I do the same thing. So say I draw the same object, but this time I do this. Again, now I've really informed the space again. I'm designed three different spaces here, because I have the paper in front that has a hole in it. I have the stick that's behind it that now you can see through the hole, and then it's this space in here beyond that that gives me this additional infinite space going behind these objects. This really has to do with ambiguity. In your drawing, sometimes you can draw something that's ambiguous. You don't really understand what it is. And so you do these things to be able to inform the viewer of what that space really is. So next I want to talk about detail and how detail can inform space and our perception of something. So things that are up close to us, we see in greater detail. Things that are further away from us, we see in less detail. So say for instance, I'm going to do a series of boxes. So I have a box here, and then I have a box behind it, and I have a box behind it. Now, I'm using perspective here. That's another video, because it's going to take a little bit more time to just go over perspective. So I'm not going to do that on this video, which has to do also with perception, but I'm going to talk about detail. If I start to detail this front and give it some sort of, like it's, I don't know, give it some sort of pattern and really detail this out. So I'm detailing the cube, say the light source is on the top, so it's less over here, and it has a cast shadow on it and all that. So say I do that kind of detail on this, but now on this one I do less detail. Maybe even kind of do like a crosshatch like that, and then the shadow coming out of it. And this one even less, where it's just shade. You see how that gives you this idea of perception of depth. And so the closer you get here, the more detail you have. The further away, the less detail there is. So the next thing I want to talk about in regards to informing space has to do with contrast. And you can do that, say, with a value shift. So that is the things that are closer, say I'm contrasting that against things that are behind me. I'm do that basically as a value shift, but there are other ways of doing it. So say I have some grass, and then I have grass behind that, and then I have grass behind that, and then I have grass behind that. So right now, it all looks like it's all in one space here. There's no contrasting value. But if I start to darken up the stuff in the front, that darkness gives you that idea of this contrasting idea that this is moving forward. And even if I move into even darker or more defined now, obviously I can go back to the detail and do some more actual detail up front. That even gives me a better idea of contrasting values, and that moves forward while this in the back starts to recede. So that's contrasting, and that's another way of understanding space and our perception of space when it comes to drawing. So now to illustrate my point when it comes to understanding perception is I am going to draw this Brazilian pepper tree forest. It's something that I pulled out of the ground a few years back, and I've been working with it. And it's got a pretty good shape. This you're looking at the front of it, multi-trunk, so we can work with overlapping. There's a lot of foliage, so I can work with detail, and I can define space by using this particular tree. But for purposes of the drawing and purposes of talking about what I've been talking about, I'm going to turn it a little bit, even exaggerate this idea of perception in space. So I'm going to start drawing this, and probably zoom through this as you're looking at the video. But for now, I'm just going to focus on drawing. Okay, so that's about a half hour worth of work on here, and there's a variety of things that I can now show you that gives you an idea of how we can understand perception. This is for purposes of this particular demo that I did this. I probably work on this a little bit more and try to dial it in a little bit better. But for demo purposes and explanation, I think this will suffice. Okay, so we already have what you would, I guess you would call a more mature space in here where there's already depth that you feel in the drawing. So the first we were talking about how children would draw, and they would really pretty much draw it as a flat object. They would probably draw it more like this. So it's flat and then has its pot there. But what we're doing is we're actually looking at what we're drawing at. We're trying to be descriptive in regards to what we're drawing at, so we end up with something like this. So there's a lot of areas that can cause ambiguity. That is this leaf in front of the other leaf, or what's going back and forth? And so when I put more detail in this area, that's actually saying that this is moved forward. And when there's less detail back here, that's telling you that it's further back. And so also the value shift, you can see that particularly in the pot, where it's a little lighter in here, a little darker in here, to kind of give you some separation as far as depth is and as far as value. I also did a lot of detail in this area up here. So this area informs the rest of the artwork in regards to the soil. So I don't have to do a lot of work in this area if I do a lot of detail in this area. You need to let your viewer be able to use their own mind to continue with the idea of the texture that you create. So you can see that I don't have a lot of detail in here. It's actually more abstracted, and so this starts to become more idealized or an imagined space, where I try to be a little more real in regards to these areas of where they are in the tree, which is my descriptive space. But yet, even though I'm imagining and I'm exaggerating some things, this pot's clearly exaggerated for perspective reasons. There's also some idealized, symbolic ideas of mark making in here that again gives you that sense of depth. So that's what I did on this in order to give you an example of what I was talking about when it comes to perception. The way we perceive things is not necessarily the way we end up drawing them, and what I'm trying to do is connect those a little bit closer with you so that what you see you actually draw. So the next videos will talk about, I want to cover perspective in a little more detail. I also want to talk about tools that they're available for you to use in order to really dial in your drawings. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like what you see, please like on the YouTube channel and subscribe to my channel, as well as you'll find me on Instagram and Facebook under Ron Riekers. And if you have any questions, just comment below. Otherwise, enjoy your bonsai drawing, and I'd love to see what you do as we progress through these videos, and feel free to ask me any questions that you have. Okay, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.